welcome to the Earth Feels podcast.
I'm Rose.
And I'm Christine.
Welcome to Earth Feels, the podcast for people feeling overwhelmed by the endlessly gloomy climate news.
Where every week we have soul-based conversations about climate change and explore the idea that climate change may be happening for us as much as it is happening to us.
If you are ready to shift your focus and secure the future for our kids and our grandkids, then this is the podcast for you.
And yes, we do know how to spell. In episode 2, we are going to look at the question about how do we unfreeze ourselves. And we're going to share some good news on the climate change front. We're going to have, as always, an action tip. And last but not least, a sanity tip to help us make it through these crazy times that we're living in. So let's get started.
Absolutely. So today's podcast is entitled, How Do We Unfreeze Ourselves? And that is basically the title of Christine's book, Unfreeze Yourself, 5 Ways to Take Action on Climate Change Now for the sake of your family, your health, and your planet. We'll be talking in the beginning a little bit about why we are doing this, and then we will be talking about Christine's book.
I'm up here in Northern Ontario. Rose is down in Massachusetts, and we're both women who are very concerned about climate change, and we think it's about time that we start having a different kind of conversation, one that's not fear-based, but that talks about the opportunities that climate change presents to make a better world for all of us.
Absolutely. So, Christine, do you want to talk about how you got started on writing your book and what your background is a little bit?
Okay, so like a really small question.
Exactly.
Well, for years, I would have called myself or described myself as a climate change avoider. I knew that it was a really big problem for my daughters. I've got 2 daughters who are in their 20s. I just tried not to think about it as much as possible. So when An Inconvenient Truth came out, I never found a convenient time to watch it because I was avoiding the topic. And really what happened in 2009 are a couple of things. One is that I got hired as a writer. So my background is I was a nurse for over 20 years, and then I got into researching and writing. And so I was hired by an eco-school website. A school division was developing this website, and they gave me their list of topics to research and to basically make a synopsis for that was interesting and accessible for elementary school kids. So for any of you who've ever done any sort of writing, you'll know, especially nonfiction, if you write 2 paragraphs, that means you've researched, 10 books kind of thing,
Exactly.
especially when you have to condense it. So I had 6 months to do this project, and I immersed myself in it. And one of the topics was climate change, so I couldn't avoid it any longer. So that was what happened early in 2009 for me. At the same time, I read a book called The Geography of Hope by a Canadian author called Chris Turner. And he, after the birth of his baby daughter, a few years earlier, he decided that he needed to find out what was going right out there on the planet to make a livable world for her. And because he'd years ago, before he started writing, he'd worked for Greenpeace and gone door knocking, and he knew about everything that was bad that was going on, and he didn't have a lot of hope. So for his daughter and for himself as a father, he started on this journey, and then he turned it into this book. So there was hope out there.
What's the
I
name
found
of the
that
book
from
again?
that book. It's called The Geography of Hope.
The Geography of Hope.
By Chris Turner. Yeah.
Okay.
It was probably put out in 2007, 2008. And the third thing was that we had really weird weather all summer in 2009. I live in northern Ontario, in the middle of lots of lakes and rocks and trees, and usually summer is fabulous. And it just rained a lot in that summer, and just I don't know. I wasn't used to checking the weather all the time. It's just kind of, you'd get up and the sun would be shining, and maybe there'd be a bit of rain, but it was kind of a miserable summer. So those three things sort of combined. And the fourth thing actually was that I had got on the email subscription list for avaz.org. And in September of 2009, they sent out an email about this new organization called 350.org, which had been started earlier that year by Bill McKibben, who's from your neck of the woods, kind of, isn't he, in Vermont? Or yeah. And so the thing I really liked about 350.org, because as we've talked about, climate change is such a huge topic, and how do you even understand it? And what 350.org did, they'd made a very short little video that talked about why 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide was what scientists were saying is safe for civilization to continue, and how at that point we were above it. We're about 380 parts per million, and why that was a concern. So it was a snappy little video, and I thought, okay, I can understand that. 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide or less is where we should be, and we're above it. Of course, now
we're
way above
yeah.
it.
Yep.
Yeah. So that seems like the good old days when we were only at 380 back in 2009. So yeah, that
10
was kind
years.
of my...
So you've been doing this for 10 years.
Yeah. And so 350.org was organizing in October sort of a global climate change awareness event where it was encouraging people in their home communities to get together, make signs or do something that had 350 on them. And so I was back in the small community that I live in Northern Ontario that year. For whatever reason, I was traveling in between, living in two places, but I happened to be back home in Red Lake in Northern Ontario. And so I organized with some friends who are also concerned environmentalists, a little photo shoot in downtown Red Lake by the Norseman airplane. Ironically, that's one of our icons. Of course, airplanes are part of the problem, but...
Or rather, what fuels airplanes is part of the problem, and biofuels are an option for flying that needs to be taken seriously.
They're also what drive the economy, because there's lots of fishing lodges, and lots of fly-in fishing lodges use airplanes, obviously. So we gathered together, and I'd made this banner, and I just put 350 or bust in big letters on the banner. We took the photo. There was maybe, I don't know, 15 or 20 of us. And that felt good to do something. And so after that, I started blogging about climate change in November of 2009. And then I blogged every day on I called my blog 350 or Bust. And I blogged every day for about 5 years, until I just couldn't anymore. I was too stressed. And that's another story for another day. So that's my background. I moved from a climate change avoider to a very concerned climate change mom and activist in 2009. And I got involved in different organizations. Transition Towns is an organization or movement really that started in the UK around that time, 2006, maybe 2007. And I also got involved with an organization that started in the US called Citizens Climate Lobby. And myself and two other women started the first 3 Citizens Climate Lobby groups in Canada. And Citizens Climate Lobby, I owe a lot to them. They really educated me about building bridges with people who disagree with you, because CCL, which is what Citizens Climate Lobby is abbreviated to, is all about meeting with politicians So it taught me a lot because I was pretty, I've taken down my 350 or bust blog because there was a lot of anger and frustration that I was expressing then because there was so much opposition on the part of our political leaders to doing anything about this problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and
I hear
it's
you there.
continued now. Yeah. So CCL really taught me to embody the principles really of, Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi, where love is an active tool. Marshall Saunders, who founded CCL back in, was it 2006 or something like that? He said in a conversation we had while I was researching my book, he even then in 2015 when we were talking, he said he still believed we could love people into caring about climate change. And he was inspired by Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. So that was what I did up until, so I blogged until 2014, was active in Citizens Climate Lobby and Transition Movement, which is all about relocalizing as a response to climate change. CCL and transition towns are different ways of approaching the issue of climate change, and I found for me that they worked well together. So in 2015, I wasn't blogging every day, but I just decided that I needed to write about my experience, and my audience is very specifically other parents and grandparents who are really concerned about climate change and don't know what to do.
I would be part of that audience. I mean, and I think as we've had a lot of these discussions, the biggest fear is huge right now, in my humble opinion, and people don't want to talk about what's happening. And so I guess that's in my world. That's why I'm interested in doing this, is because I think how do you move from that frozen state? Like the title of your book is completely appropriate. How do we unfreeze ourselves? My journey does not have nearly the depth that yours does, and I am so appreciative that you would want to partner to do this podcast, because I have the passion, but not the experience that you do. I came to climate, when I went to see Al Gore in person, when he was first, so back the truck up, I met Al Gore when I had a baby on my hip, when he was running, my eldest, who's now 28, when Al was running with Bill Clinton, I went to see him at the University of Washington. They were doing their across the country, It's the Economy, Stupid bus trip. And I had an opportunity to see him, and I was bowled over by him. I went by his intelligence. And I know he's maybe not the most charismatic man, but give me a brain any day. And I stood there with my kid, who was not walking yet. And I thought to myself, if Clinton picks him as his running mate, then I'm convinced that Clinton's the man for me. And so it really wasn't, it was just Gore's intelligence and even back then, he was interested in climate. So fast forward, after Gore lost the election, he really got involved in Inconvenient Truth. And he had written a book prior to that, and I'm not sure if that was the same name. I'd have to look that up. But he had put the movie together. And again, came to Washington. I was living in Seattle at the time. And when I heard he was coming, I got online right away and got tickets. And unbeknownst to me, people were just like, people really didn't care. We were in the front row. And I had 4 or 5 girlfriends that, I would drag them to every political whatever. And we were in the front row. And he came out, and and a little worse for wear. You know, he had been through the grinder himself. I'm sure having the election pulled out from underneath him had he looked like he'd been comforting himself with food, which I totally understand, which I totally get.
Don't we all?
Yeah, yeah. And but he came out onto the stage and he said, and I'm going to tear up at this. He said,
That's okay.
don't ever believe that one person cannot make a difference in the world, and don't ever believe that that one vote doesn't make a difference in the world, because I stand here in front of you as living proof that one vote makes a difference. And I was, again, it tears me up. I thought, this man, he's here on the planet for a reason. And he showed the slides, and and it's overwhelming to see what's happening in other parts of the world. I still, to this day, I'm amazed. We live in our privileged society, and yes, there's been a lot about white privilege, but I've lived on the coasts. I have lived in very educated areas of the country. I'm privileged to have a college education that I never, it was just a given when I was a child that I would have. So I've lived a very privileged existence, and that's not the case for most of the world. And I think we really, I don't want to get too philosophical, but as the biggest consumer society in the world, the U.S. especially, Canada, Australia, Western civilization, we really need to take a look at how our actions impact the rest of the world. And so anyway, fast forward, I saw Al Gore, and then had a bunch of transition happen in my life. And I think it was in 2015, 2016, when he was doing his training, climate reality training in Toronto. Christine and I, actually, kind of an interesting story. We were both there, but we didn't meet there, which kind of feels like that sliding glass door. The universe wanted us to get together, and we didn't meet then. An aside, Christine actually came to Boston a couple of years later for a tapping convention, and I was supposed to go to that convention, but declined at the last minute to go, and so we didn't meet there. And
you know what, Rose? I did not realize that you were supposed to be at that
Margaret Lynch
workshop.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
No way.
Yeah.
So then the third
was through Ryan Eliason's Visionary Business, and we were in a group together, and I guess we kind of connected on Facebook and said, let's meet when we both go out to San Diego, and
right.
And we ended up having dinner.
I know. I think that was because I knew you were part of Climate Reality. Mm-hmm. I had connected that you were in Ryan's group, and you were also part of Climate Reality. So I think I messaged you before to say, let's meet. And then we did in San Diego, California. Yep. That's crazy.
Yeah. So to me, I live my life by the golden thread, and just follow where the thread is. And that sounds crazy to a lot of people, but serendipity shows up, synchronicities show up, and it feels like we were meant to come together to do this. So whatever. So I'm excited to be able to tap into your wealth of knowledge and share our communities, and as gray-haired elders, gasp.
Well, you are older than me, I think.
Oh, thanks. Okay. Well, I'm older than a lot of people. So,
not by much, but just.
I think it's. I was having this conversation with my 28-year-old the other day, and I was, telling him what I was doing, and that I was going to be doing this podcast, and walking on another tightrope and not knowing where it was going, and no net below. And I said, but at the end of the day, when I leave this planet, I want to know that I did everything I could to help it survive. And he paused for our conversation paused for a second, and he said, "You mean you did everything you could to help us survive?" And I don't have grandchildren yet. I don't have grandchildren yet. And you don't not either. Is that correct?
I don't either. No.
Yeah, and I'm, uh, yeah, there's a big unknown. There's a big question mark out there. So,
Hmm. Well, I love that story because, like I said, I learned something new today. You probably have told me the Margaret Lynch workshop story before, but hearing it again connected to the fact that we're both in Toronto and then happened to meet in San Diego kind of by fluke again, because there was probably 500 people there.
oh, from all over
Um,
the world. Yeah.
yeah. And then I need to tell everybody that you reached out to me a month or two ago after watching David Attenborough's Our Planet, and you felt like you got a download about having a podcast, and I happened to be part of that download.
Yeah, that was literally, I mean, you know how you have those moments where I can see myself I was sitting in the corner of my couch. It was episode 2 of Attenborough's, and this message just came to me, and it was like, contact Christine, you need to do a podcast. And I was like, what? I know nothing about technology. But yeah, so I just sent. I mean, I was literally on my couch, sent that message to you on on my iPhone that night. And when you commented back, I was like, I woke up the next morning and your message was there, and I was like, oh my God, we're actually going to do this. So
Because I had been thinking about doing a podcast. I just knew I wasn't going to do it by myself. I just couldn't take that on. That was too much of a commitment because as you'd have and as everybody who's listening to this podcast has, there's a lot going on in my life. And that was just an added something that I couldn't take on myself. But when the universe told you that I needed to be part of it, and I thought, okay, that means it's time.
yeah, yeah,
And and here we are stepping up. So just so you know, the technical part, we are are on a learning curve. However, I will say that when I started to blog back in 2009, first of all, I didn't tell my family for the month because I know my daughters who were then like teenagers and in university and high school would have gone, you're doing what? You don't even know how to really turn the computer on, Mom. So, and I got blogging for dummies out of the library. So if I can do that, I feel like there's a learning curve there, but I mastered it, and we can do this. We will learn and have help along the way as required. And I'm just really excited about the fact that we're doing this. I'm not excited about climate change, but there it is. This is our generation's challenge. This is our generation and the generations, obviously, that are younger than us. It's our challenge. And just like in the Second World War, that was a challenge, and the generations, what they call the greatest generation, sort of rose up to meet that challenge. This is our challenge. And so if part of what we're doing is increasing the conversation, spreading the conversation about climate change, that is really important, because I don't think we're going to talk about the 5 points in my book on this podcast, because it feels like we've had a really good conversation and it's probably enough for this one. But I will say that the first thing the first step in my 5 points to unfreezing yourself is just talking about climate change. So here we are. That's what we're doing. And hopefully our listeners will join in the conversation on Facebook and in our comment section. And let's bring it out of the shadows. I do shadow work in my wellness practice. I haven't talked about that, but I have a wellness practice. And I'm drawn to shadow work with the chakras, which is what I was doing in Boston with Margaret Lynch. And I feel like climate change is our society's collective shadow. and in the same way that we all have our individual shadows. And so I'm really glad that we're doing this, and we're going to be talking about it more.
Sounds great. Sounds great. Yeah. I just want to touch a little bit on your book. And you're right, our conversation has been going on maybe longer than we thought. Which, to get two women together, and then when does that happen? But there were your first three steps, and I think I've said this to you, were about talk therapy, this is what we're talking about right now. Just getting out there and talking to people. And it doesn't have to be a big thing. I think we all need to realize that you don't need to be a physicist. You don't need to be a marine biologist. You don't need to be an economist, an environmentalist. You just need to be a person who cares. And don't we all want to see the world go on? Don't we all want to see giraffes still exist, and polar bears, and the Arctic ice? Don't we want right whales? I mean, it goes on and on. It's all interlinked, and I think all we need to do is be caring. So how do you have a conversation with somebody about your concerns? Do you have a suggestion to open the door?
Well, so I write about this in my book. I have been talking about climate change for 10 years now, and it has changed a bit in the last year or two, just because the number of disasters, droughts, fires, floods, yeah, they're just in the news more and more. So there's more opportunities and more awareness on people's part. But for most of those 10 years, I joke, but it's really not a joke. It really was true that talking about climate change was as socially unacceptable as farting in public, because it had the same kind of reaction. Not that I have that much experience farting in public. I just want to say that. But, people just going on the record, but people, when I would mention climate change, and I would do it, I would bring it up anywhere, anytime. Like, I'm quite involved in my community in different boards and committees. And, sometimes on an arts board, I'd mention just kind of, people would be talking about the weather, and I'd mention climate change, and the response of people was usually to look away, pretend that I hadn't said anything. They were embarrassed for me. It was and just kind of let it drop, like with that elephant in the room nobody's talking about, and then they'd move on and talk about something else. So it really was very weird, and it made me want to bring it up more because it was so
because you're a disruptor.
Weird.
Yeah.
I must be. And so I've gone door to door, knocking on people's doors in my community, in a city that's down the way. And I'm like the climate change Jehovah's Witness. And it's good practice. It's good practice. Just so how do you do that?
So you knock on the door, and then what do you say? They open the door, and you're like, "Hi, I'm Christine, and I want to talk to you about climate change."
Yeah, I'm really concerned about climate change. Are you concerned about climate change? And some people would say, nope, not at all. But a lot of people said, yeah, this was 10 years ago when I did this in the city. And they're like, yeah, the weather's really weird. I walked up to this young mom in the park who was pushing her little one in the swing, and I said, I'm really concerned about climate change. Are you? I want to talk to people, other people who are. And she teared up. She's like, I'm so devastated. I have this little one. She was getting ready to go back to work full time. And she said, I just sit and cry. Wow. When I think about the world that he's going into, so there are people who really want to talk about it. That's what I learned. Yeah, there's people who don't, but that's okay. Those are short conversations. But yeah, and at that point, the reason I went door knocking over that period of time is because there was actually what was called the climate accountability legislation was going through the Canadian Parliament, and it passed. This was in 2010, but then it got shut down in our conservative-dominated Senate, to their shame. But it was going. So that was something I could tell people about. That's actually why I was doing it at that time, getting people to call or send postcards. So that was a specific action that people could take.
So I think that would be a great place to leave it here. Maybe that's what we need to be talking about. If we're going to do one action step per podcast, the action step for this podcast would be courageous and address one person. Can you talk to one person a day and say, I'm concerned about climate change, are you? And some people will say no, and that's okay. I think from my sales background, it's like, okay, you're going to get like out of every 10 you ask, you're going to get 9 no's, but one person who is, then you've opened the door for them, and ask them to go forward and have the conversation too. We need to open the door.
Yep.
We need to open the door. Talk therapy. I love that.
Well, I feel like that's what we're doing here too.
It is
therapeutic.
Yeah, it is. Just we need that catharsis, and so that would lead me to my personal tip for being sane, for staying sane when all of this is crazy, while all of this is crazy, which I don't see ending anytime soon, unfortunately, is I go out in nature and I literally stand barefoot in my yard. I garden in my yard barefoot. There's been all kinds of things written recently about the microbes in the soil and how they are a natural antidepressant. And maybe that's part of it. But for me, it feels that natural, that connection with Mother Earth, that connection with nature. I feel it through the bottom of my feet. And I kind of stand there and envision my roots going down into the earth, and mother's roots coming up and them entwining, and knowing that we've kind of lost our connection with Earth. We are part of the natural environment. So that helps me stay sane, even though my neighbors probably look at me and think I'm insane doing it.
I love that. I think that's so important. And in my book, I just call it nature therapy. Spend time in nature. So that's our sanity tip for our podcast on Earth Feels.
Thank you. And this is Rose and Christine, and we'll talk to you next week.
Bye-bye.
That's this week's episode of Earth Feels. Special thanks to singer-songwriter Kristen Hoffman for generously allowing us to use Song for the Ocean. Thanks for listening.
Don't forget, subscribe to our podcast on iTunes or Google Play so you don't miss an episode. Catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Children of the earth, I'm calling out. There's a mission for you and for me. You see, your mother, she has been suffering, and the truth is told beneath the sea.